It's not the mic that's the issue, because I have the mic right now. It's
then where's the thing that lets us use the mic?
That is the key, and that is...
I
haven't been able to go out and actually get that, because it's... The trouble is, I don't want to just get something, because that would be... I'd end up getting some cheap thing that broke in 2 seconds.
Well, not if you were discerning.
This is a limpid
color, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, it's a little... It's very... The foams are nice. I don't...
Well, mine went away pretty fast.
Well, I mean, it dissipates quickly, sure, but...
I feel like we should have a game. If I'm trying to think of the layout, because the problem is these conversations are long, so they span several weeks.
Sure.
Whereas,
you meaning we should have a game that keeps it consistent, or
no? As in, like the shadow, because the shadows. Well, I guess no. We're still ahead because Shadows, the first one that we recorded, is coming out this week, and then the next one's coming out next weekend. Whereas I've got 3, 4 other topics in the hopper of things. Because these conversations go on for a while unless they get broken up into more videos. Sure. Perhaps we should stop doing that. I'll just start publishing them mostly unedited, and it'll be like big honking things.
Long 4 hours. I don't see people don't.
Well,
outside of people like us,
that's far better than the smell.
You know, it's good.
That's much, but we should not tell anybody what it is.
So that we can just keep them to ourselves. What?
I don't know. That's actually much better than I thought. Because the slightly, because it has a vaguely cider-esque color.
Yeah.
And it smells somewhat artificially sweet, but that's actually surprising.
Yeah.
The thing is that these are just easier, and I don't have any games right now.
Sure. That's fine. I mean, it doesn't bother me, although you just played your games without me, is the truth.
I played that one.
Which one was that?
It's called Spiritfarer. It came out a couple years ago. It was like an indie game that got a lot of people talking, and I was like, oh, okay. They had a sale, and it was like $4.
So you,
So I just put it on in the background. I'm going to check how that video's doing. Because it did weirdly well. Literally, I had it set to auto-upload at like, I think it's like 8 in the morning or 7. And when I looked at it at like 11, and it was like, 50 views. And I'm like, that's really unusually high.
That's high for us, gents and ladies, if you're there.
If
you're not, where you at?
If you are, what's your address? where would these ladies be? Let me see how it is doing, because I'm very curious. I wonder if it's either...
What was it titled?
I titled it something vaguely kind of...
clickbaity?
Not exactly. I think I called it, because that was the Forest for the Trees one, I think. So I think that's what I called it.
Well, see, that actually makes sense to the discussion, though. That's not clickbaity.
No, that's what I'm saying. I just think it was probably the screenshot of the game, and people were like, oh, that's a famous game. See, it's stalling now at 65, which is still the highest.
It's a famous game? Which one?
That one, the Spiritfarer game. That's the one I put on in the background for that video. Show me mine stats.
Mine comfy stats.
If you can't tell, we're tired.
You may be tired. I'm fine.
I'm not tired physically. I'm tired emotionally.
I'm tired of humanity.
Yes.
I'm tired of this, Grandpa.
What?
Oh, come on.
Oh, is that... What?
It's that what?
I can't think of the name. It does sound... Is it going to be a VeggieTales thing?
No.
Oh.
It's Holes.
I haven't seen that, and I don't even know how long.
Yeah. That had so much going for it, but it was a bit...
Did it really? Because I don't really know why.
It was a bit of an odd movie. The book was good, but I think...
I didn't even know it had a book.
Try to... Okay.
I was not that generation. That was a thing that was already out by the time I was around.
It hurts my feelings.
I didn't care much
for it. Making me feel old.
Well, you are. Yar! So are we going to abide by not telling people what this is? I still think we've said it.
Yeah, it's by a brand called Old Keg, and I think I'll just leave it there.
No, we might as well just... Because the universal version of this Harry Potter thing was probably closer to what's described in the books. Yeah. But it had a bit of an odd... Like, you wouldn't normally drink something like that, is I guess my primary qualm with it. It's so thick and syrupy and everything. I'm not sure I would do that.
Have you had the one from Universal?
Yeah, when we were there. We were all delicious. There. I was not wild about it because I think it's a little, again, it feels kind of overly saccharine. This kind of does too, but...
Yeah, but in a
it's not
better
so
way.
Yeah, it isn't so monstrously
viscous.
thick.
Not quite as viscous.
Let me see how this one's doing.
It's got a bit of a lighter vibe to it. 65
is still the highest it's ever been, but it does seem to have tapered, so I think probably it was a thumbnail base. Okay, maybe not. 3.2 hours average watch time. Sadly, that's high. I mean, 3 people watched the video all the way through. And none of them were me this time, even.
2 of them were me. No, I'm just playing. That would be rude. I haven't watched that one.
I'm rather curious about it.
I honestly...
See, the click-through rate's not that different. It's a 1% click-through rate, which is fairly average. And I don't put any effort into the thumbnails, so that's not any better than any other. It just has more impressions for some reason. 5,000 impressions is unusually high, and I have no control over that. What is an impression? It means who people who the video actually appears to. But 3.2 hours, that means... Okay, no, average view duration is 3 minutes. So that means... So it's not to say that the average person watched it all the way through, but it means that at least 3 people... Or the equivalent of 3 people did. I don't know what that's about. I don't care either. I don't care now. That's why we're doing this.
You can't tell. We just do these for our own.
Hey, that's why we did it from the beginning.
That's certainly true.
So we said even if it doesn't go anywhere, we would still do it because it's fun.
You're just along for the ride.
Honestly, I can't lean back when I move my chair like this.
On my ride.
It's more just a matter of like, hey, I think we say some vaguely poignant things from time to time, so having them on recording is pretty nice.
Sure.
I'm having chocolate. I said last week that we didn't give a crap when we were playing Shadows of War. We give even less of a crap now. How's your week been? Am I telling you enough about mine?
Well, it's been interesting. You know, we got onto the topic a little bit, but I think as we've talked about this in the past. I don't know if we've ever talked about it specifically on online, but the idea that as you start to grow and change yourself, how many people have not necessarily pushed back, but they basically tell you you're acting like you're not yourself, and it's like, well,
I'm not.
No, I'm improving. That doesn't mean I'm somehow being disingenuous. And some people act like that's what you're doing. I had to make the case recently, like there was a person that made that statement to me and essentially said, you know, it's because of this person, isn't it? And I'm like, no, it's actually because of a season of life I walked through, and there was a pretty significant change in that.
So you're saying someone called you a Tommy simp? I'm reading between the lines. Is that what happened?
No, it wasn't actually about that.
Someone said, "You're trying too hard to be Tommy. You're like that guy who does that sketch."
I love that guy though. He's hilarious. Well, shout out to
it's not just him. There was a whole. I think because back when Peaky Blinders was actually on air, there was a whole trend of people making fun of, like, I watched Peaky Blinders once, and it's like guy in a suit, and he starts talking with a British accent, even though he's American. Like, he's not the only guy to do that. I just think his videos are the funnier ones.
I don't deny that it certainly brought out characteristics in my own personality that were like,
well, I can't judge because Silco did something to me.
That makes it sound like he touched you or something, yeah. he cut me deep just now. No, it wasn't actually about the Peaky Blinders thing, although that came up in the discussion, and it was like, well, the bottom line is I went through a very difficult season, and there were some people within that context that certainly contributed to change, both, you know, in family and in all kinds of, you know, dynamics in that regard, and I just think growth is a positive thing. and ultimately, if you allow your experiences to shape you for the better, which is ideally what they should do, then you can use them to your advantage. I think personally that's actually where the biblical context of saying that God works out everything for your good actually comes into play, because if you just spin your wheels, or again, as we talked about earlier this evening, somehow live in the past or want to recreate something that could have happened in the past, it's like, well, you're not then actually moving ahead and using life to shape you and to, it's a bit like the Jordan Peterson talks about this a bit when framing the idea of that same sentiment of God working everything out for your good. He talks about embracing the actually, you know what? I think he was talking about the passage in James where James talks about embracing trials of many kinds and that kind of thing. And then he looked at the book of Job and was basically like, well, what happens when...
Book of Job is a fascinating essay waiting to be written.
How so?
I'm going to write an essay.
It's your fascinating essay waiting to be written.
Well, I just think that it's never been... I shouldn't say never. It has, in fact. I don't see enough attention given to it.
That's certainly true.
G.K. Chesterton apparently wrote a commentary on it, which is highly regarded, which I want to read, because I both appreciate him and I'm just curious about why no one talks enough about Job. But
it's an uncomfortable book, is why.
Yeah.
It answers a question that we don't really want to answer.
I would actually argue it doesn't answer a question.
Well,
it raises a question.
It raises a question,
and
yes.
only sort of gives a, blunt answer that doesn't feel very...
It highlights the sovereignty of God in a way that says, yeah, it's not up to you. So there you go.
It's the Bible's Sisyphus.
Yeah. Well, and it's...
What do you think of this? Because I'll admit, this is not as good as the stuff I had as a kid.
Good, but it's not very lingery. Which I think is what makes it good, because that... How do you actually pronounce that?
It's just Milka.
Milka.
It's an Austrian chocolate. Very good.
The thing about that in comparison to other chocolates is that I find that other chocolates, you maybe can eat like 3 or 4 pieces and you're like, I actually feel like, no, I don't want to eat anymore. Whereas this, it's like, oh, I just ate a chocolate bar. Where did that go?
Yeah.
It's a bit like...
This isn't as thick as the ones I remember, because they used to actually be pretty beefy. This is much more thin. Maybe that's because of the caramel filling, I'm not sure. But
anyway, all I'm saying is that life will change you, and if you allow that to be a positive thing, you certainly will have to, not defend, that makes it sound weird, but you'll have to
you might
qualify what's going on in your life. But I made the case and said, actually, I think it's this, and this is how it's changed me. And they said, oh, okay.
I'm intrigued by the mythological character of Proteus. Because, admittedly, when I was first introduced to the concept, it was actually in the 48 Laws of Power, who does not exactly use it correctly.
Do you have you read that fully?
Yes.
Really? I didn't realize you had that in your library.
You mentioned it before, and I told you I owned it, so you just don't recall.
In the same... Yeah, I guess so.
It was in one of the Shadows of Mordor ones. It was when you were on your...
Yes,
you were on a Peaky Blinders.
Was I shutting down my computer at that point?
No, it was a Peaky Blinders thing. You were all, interested. But he makes reference, and he describes him in a way which is not mythologically accurate, but is useful for the example he was trying to give.
So
he's not off. It's not wrong, but it's perhaps an extrapolation more than is in the text. Because
he appropriates him.
He describes Proteus as the god who makes himself because of the fact that he is a shapeshifter. In fact, he's not strictly speaking a god. I believe he's just sort of a mythological... Because he's not even strictly speaking a man. He's a shape-shifting entity. But... So he sort of describes that as being in his example for it in what he's trying to say in that particular chapter was talking about you need to be adaptable, and sometimes you need to have different faces that you show different people for the sake of
I actually made
being able to get
Well, see, and I made that exact
what
case
exactly
to this,
you're made to pursue your aims in the right context. And so he describes him as sort of the god who chooses his own shape, which it's like, yes, that's what it is, but he almost makes it seem like it doesn't have anything to do with being like self-made, which is sort of how he described it, almost as if like he created himself almost. Because I have done research into that and I can't find any, but I know that there are some mythological
recreated himself or reframed.
No, because that's not exactly, because it's just shape-shifting. It isn't like he transformed in any way other than appearance.
His essence did not change.
And that's where I guess I was thinking, because I'm sure that there's some mythological character that I'm thinking of that was like almost a sort of Ouroboros, I created myself thing. And I couldn't find who I was thinking of that was like that, but even then, the other thing I quite like about the character of Proteus is that, and one of the things I'm like, I sort of, in a self-aggrandizing way, it's like, well, that sort of resonates with me a little bit, because he's described as
on a social level.
No, in this next thing I'm about to say, he is a man who knows all the past and the future, but doesn't like to be asked about it. And so I'm not suggesting that I know those things, but I do.
I'm just implying
I do know that I am definitely someone who's like, I like to think about things, but I don't like when people ask me about things. There was actually a joke, because this is apparently this is not an uncommon thing amongst my personality type, where someone made a meme. I think it was a Myers-Briggs meme, when it was like, I've learned a lot of things. It was like INTJ. I've learned a lot of things this past week. Anyone else? Oh, do you care to elaborate? No.
No.
Just things. Or no, I think that's what it was like. It was like, oh, like what things? Just things. Care to elaborate? No.
No.
And I was like, I definitely, I know that I sometimes have that tendency where I'm like, this is an interesting thing I've learned. Oh, care to share it? No. No! Now get out! You're spoiling me moment.
I made that exact point, though, in fact, about the idea of, it's a bit of the Pauline, I've become all things to all people kind of thing, but it's the...
I've just noticed, for random diversion, Audacity has a weird feature that tells you how long you could record until you fill your hard drive.
Where's that?
It's at the bottom of the screen. It says, we could record for up to 197 hours with the space we have left on the disk.
Huh.
Which sounds impressive. On the other hand, this is a terabyte hard drive. I know I've already used a lot of it, so perhaps that's not... but that's like... because 200 hours, that's less than 10 days, but that's 10 uninterrupted days. So I suppose perhaps... I don't know exactly how file-heavy audio is, but... sorry, random.
Anyway, no, I made the statement because one of the concerns that was brought up was essentially you're being less... perhaps charismatic or personable than you normally are, and I basically said, well, what I've learned in this season is that not everybody in my life gets to have that space. And basically, as I've applied that in throughout just various capacities in my life, I've realized that I get to then choose to utilize that skill set when I want to, rather than just giving it away all the time. And not only does it help me conserve energy and not end up getting taken advantage of, but it also allows me to say, well, that's a skill set that I have. It doesn't somehow change the fact that it's in my wheelhouse of what I can do, but that doesn't mean that I always have to be that. I mean, and I think sometimes people get the impression that because you are a personable person or you're one way or this way, like for instance, for you, if you are more of a reserved individual, when people see you more out of your comfort zone, they go, you're not acting like yourself. It's like, well, actually I am. It doesn't mean I can't have different moments of diversion.
And I still think that's why the Proteus thing still comes to mind, is because that's very much that.
Well, that's why I was getting
attitude. It's just going, I don't have to remain fixed, nor should I, even if I could.
Indeed.
Because on one hand, I think the expectation that you would do that is in fact a damaging thing, because that implies that you could never change for any reason, much less whether it's a good reason or not. Whereas I would say the ability to adapt is, in fact, a good thing to have.
I think initially it makes people upset or
people
discomforted.
People don't want to have. People want constancy, and they don't want to have to deal with.
Well, but it's more than that. I think another part of it is that it gives them authority and power to do that in their own life, and they don't like what it makes them feel because it requires that they actually own their choices.
I don't know that it gives them that power because I think
sure,
it casts a light on the fact that they might be using it as an excuse to say, "Well, I am just this way,
right?"
I can't change it because no one can change it, and if you're around changing, and then they go, well, that means I could change, and then that means they have to face the fact that I'm not, even though, and then it's most people just, what's the word we coined the other time? Autophobic. Most people are afraid of looking at themselves.
That should be another meme. Some guy looking into me like, ah!
I already did my DW meme. It's essentially that.
Kind of, I suppose.
I don't know.
Anyway, but that was my week.
Are we getting into therapy? Because maybe that's what we just need is some therapy.
Maybe you need therapy.
What am I here for?
Are you...
Tell me how I should feel about myself. We'll take turns.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're...
Well, I don't know.
How was your
Who's
week?
your mythological protagonist? Because I'll tell you what inspired this, actually.
You know... I oftentimes have said, and it hasn't just been within my higher education, but Sisyphus has been a fairly close...
You should read... I want to read The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus, because I think I would agree if I had read that.
Because I think the reason is that I feel on a very... The one spot I think that I would not specifically say I resonate with that is that I do recognize that there are certain things in life that you choose to engage in because it's a value that you have, but it is also something that feels at times fruitless. But I think there's a lot of times that is a life. It's a bit of a cycle that you find yourself in life, and you do have to embrace the kind of Sisyphean aspect to it.
You should definitely read The Myth of Sisyphus.
Like for instance, look at childbearing or child rearing more specifically.
Thanks.
Child rearing more specifically. The idea that you at times you'll wake up and go, man, we're making a lot of progress, and then you'll wake up and be like, they haven't learned anything. So it's very much like,
you don't know nothing.
I feel like
you've been here for 4 years.
And even like after they get out the door and they're like, okay, yeah, you're raised and stuff like that, you're adults. It's like, then they'll still do something stupid as an adult, and you'll go, I didn't teach you anything. Like,
yeah, well, but then you got to acknowledge that you do the same stupid things too.
Totally agree. Well. Which is when, again, I say the cyclical pattern. I mean, you see it in the even on a broader level and like on a sociological level within like the life of or the patterns of Israel, and you go, okay, wow, like how often do you have to make the same dang mistakes? But then I go, it's in our own lives too, you know.
I mean, I did just say a bit ago that I think that Job is the Sisyphus of the Bible, and. On a biblical level, if I had to pick a biblical character whom I feel a resonance with, it would be Job. And yet, for some reason, they've never jumped to Sisyphus in the Greek. I'm not sure why. Perhaps because...
Where have you tended to jump?
Well, I think maybe I was focusing more on the actual God characters. Because Sisyphus, I actually don't know the myth of Sisyphus well enough, but I believe he was just a man.
I think he was cursed to toil.
Yes, but I don't know what it was. But he was not like Prometheus was a god who was cast out because he disobeyed. Whereas Sisyphus was just a man, so it's like Daedalus. I don't know that I would. I mean, you could make the arguments like, oh, well, Daedalus was the architect and the craftsman and whatnot, and I resonate with certain elements of that. But I guess because, as I've said before, I think Greek myth is often very archetypal.
Yeah.
I think of the gods as being more of the archetypal structures than of just random people.
Sure.
I suppose Sisyphus probably of all of them comes the closest. Is Icarus a person or is Icarus also a god or a demigod?
He's a demigod, I think.
So yeah, I think maybe that's why I've never thought of it, is because I've always tried to think of which of the godlike characters, because I find them to be the most archetypal, but then none of them match as well. Other than the Proteus, which of like, regardless of the shape-shifting thing, I still think that there's just, if I were
a god.
No, because I don't think Proteus technically is either. I'm not sure what Proteus is described as. But it's like, if I did have knowledge of all present and future and past, I probably would just live on an island and be like, get annoyed when people tried to ask me questions. Like, figure it out for yourself.
Well, it gives you a whole new
Stop trying to fish.
It gives you some respect for Jesus when people were asking dumb questions. It's like,
maybe.
How long have I been with you guys? You talking about this book? You can't be talking about.
So I don't know. I've also always said that I like Hephaestus as a character, but I don't know that that's on an archetypal level, because I'm like, for me, it's more just the idea of, I've always loved the idea of the craftsman god as, it's like the fact that he makes basically every magical item in Greek mythology was somehow made by Hephaestus. It's like, I kind of like that, but that's an avocational resonance. That's not like as a person, because Hephaestus himself, I don't know what his personality is purported to be.
Right.
Other than the fact that he actually seems to be somewhat grumpy. But then again, he sort of also has reason.
Hephaestus was grumpy. I know, I
don't know. Janus is not a Greek god. He was Roman. And I'm not sure why I find him interesting, and I'm not sure I would say I resonate, but
see, I'm kind of curious because there's a guitar pedal that's brilliant. That's
Janus?
Called
Spelled that way or spelled
with the J? Yeah.
Because I don't know. There's something about him being the god of basically the god of time or the god of change. I guess maybe it's similar to the Protean idea.
I do have a bit of an obsession with time in that regard. I mean, on a horological level, when I first started looking into watches and how they work, and I've always had a fascination with. There's in fact a character in a show that my wife and I are watching right now that he talks about this idea that he is a clockmaker and puts things into motion, and he feels like he always stays ahead of time by basically being the one who makes the clock. It's a bit of what your context is as far as like does the watch run you, or do you?
That's not what I mean by that, by the way. I make reference to that because of the characters who say it, not on a.
Sure.
Have you not been catching that this whole time? You've been missing the shade I've been throwing at you?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, I don't think the shade is any less so in that the sentiment is still the same, which is like, does the clock own you or do you own the. You know,
sure.
It's like, so whether or not it's got character connotation in it, it's neither here nor there. I mean, the sentiment is the same. But
sure.
I'm just saying, so that part I certainly, I suppose, resonate with. But I don't know, there's just something about when I
think it's something that embraces the ephemerality of life. And I guess the fact that that's something most people don't want to look at.
Sure.
And so the god who's like, literally, that's all I'm about. Like, literally, Janus being the two-faced god, always looking forward and back. I'm like, there's just something about that that's kind of, like, interesting to me.
Right.
So, I don't know. The reason I got into this is because of... Where's it at? Anthem I read for the first time recently, which is... I don't know if that was Ayn Rand's first book. It was one of her first reasonably popular books before she got, like, big popularity. But... And I will agree with what I have heard as a consensus on it, which is that it's, as a book, if you're looking for a fictional story, it's pretty bland. Because I think what it is trying to be is a parable or I in fact would say you could go so far as to call it propaganda, because it kind of is. It's essentially a ideological narrative whose point supersedes its plot. And so some people don't like it because it feels awfully contrived, because of course it's trying to make a point, not be a story. But because the whole point is this is like some hypothetical future society where a future collectivist society where the word I has been removed from the vocabulary, and so everyone refers to themselves as we, as part of the group. Again, is it a heavy-handed metaphor? Yes. I don't think that was unintended. But essentially the point is this man and his sort of The woman he's attracted to, they run away together because, of course, in this society, you're not allowed to pick your spouse because that would be showing... It's got elements of Brave New World, although Brave New World is obviously meant to be a narrative first.
Sure.
It's the idea that you could never show preference for one person over another, and that's why no one's allowed to choose their own spouse, because that would be an act of choice, and that would be discrimination against people. But essentially, they flee.
So the society chooses your spouse?
No one actually has spouses. It's like you essentially, it's effectively all birth is handled by IVF, effectively. Where it's like they will take. It's not unlike Brave New World in that regard, where it's like they do. Is that the right word, IVF? Or am I thinking of a different procedure? That's the one where it's. That's my phone. It's forced. What I'm thinking of that right? Yes. Where you essentially you take where it's you basically a donor egg and a donor sperm, and so there aren't actually parents
per se.
It's just you never actually meet the child that you create. It's just everybody does this at a certain preset time, and you never get to pick anyone.
Sure.
The point then is that they run away together. They find the remnants of like the previous civilization. And he reads a bunch of these old classic antiquities books and whatnot. And so at the end, he basically decides, because also no one has unique names. They're all basically numbered. And so he chooses to give himself the name Prometheus, and he gives his wife, unofficial wife, the name Gaia. And I was like, obviously, again, people might take issue with it because it's sort of pretentious and maybe, sure, on the nose, I'll grant you. But I am sort of curious. It's like if you had, a similar thing is also done actually. But I mean,
is this a critique of?
Well, I don't exactly know what people critique it for, other than the fact that I do believe
the book in itself is a bit of a critique.
Oh, it's
of
absolutely
modern culture.
It's absolutely a propaganda against socialism,
right? Or
collectivism as a thought process at all. But there's a similar thing in Ender's Game where I forget. Is her name Valentine? His sister.
I don't know Ender's Game.
Calls her name, when she publishes her sort of pseudo-revolutionary articles, she publishes them under the name Demosthenes. It's just like, I've always been curious about the idea of adopting this sort of name of antiquity, which carries with it certain connotations.
Yeah.
That and in fact choosing it because of the connotations that you want to give, that you want to sort of arouse by the name. And that's where I was going. I'm not sure if I would ever have a clear idea of what name I would choose if I were to ever do that.
I certainly don't think Sisyphus really used useful, really, and any sort of point to be made.
It would depend on what you intended to say.
Sure.
I don't think it would be. I mean, like if you called yourself Oedipus, you'd have like questions being raised. But Sisyphus is.
That's very Solomon-esque in that you just kind of. It's not quite the life is meaningless thing, but again, it's a bit of the pointing to absurdism kind of a thing.
Well,
it's like the only thing that is meaningful is the fact that you grant it use, you give it value. It's again the value statement thing we were back to the other night of, there's a lot of times people confuse value statements with moral statements. And it's like, no, there is a very clear distinction, and I think, in that regard, it specifically highlights that. But outside of that, I feel like that particular story doesn't have any sort of weighty connotation if you use that name as some sort of moniker.
Sisyphus?
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine.
It depends on what you were saying. If you were just whined about things, that would probably not...
No, because I don't think that's what Sisyphus even is.
Well, then you need to read the myth of Sisyphus.
And
exactly. Read the myth. You should read it. I mean, I'm not saying this because I have read it, but I'm saying we should both read it because I am very curious about it. I've heard enough to know that I think I would like it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I know that there are, like for example, Saturnine as an adjective obviously stems from Saturn.
Sure.
And Saturnine is a word that I don't think does not apply to me, myself, because it's a sort of similar to sort of stolid or somber. And so And yet, but Saturn is also Kronos, who's weird. So I'm not sure that I would willingly make that association. He's the one that's like the Titan who ate his children, and I'm like, that's an odd. I don't know that I would want to leap straight to that image.
Specifically, though, it's not like
that's
Kronos
pretty much what he's
children.
known for, because he's or being the father of Zeus, who killed him because he ate his children.
No, I suppose.
So it's like, I don't know that I would want to go straight to that, but I don't know any. I guess. It's tough. I don't know. I'm glad I'm not in such a situation, because I wouldn't have such a pithy response.
Well, there you go.
Or I could just start calling myself Job. But the problem with that is...
I am Job.
Well, see, that's the problem is you could never publish anything under that name, because everyone would be like, what's this Job guy doing? Who's Job?
I got a better idea. How about I get someone who has the name Job? Okay. But, yeah.
Well, myths. I don't know why I've been thinking about them this week.
I don't know.
Tell me. You're supposed to be therapizing me.
Is the,
something to do with my subconscious trauma.
It's your subconscious is trying to find archetypal
Maybe it
familiarity.
But then I don't know what is it asking me for?
What do you want from me?
I feel like if I knew, then maybe I'd be like, oh, well, I could say that, but...
Well, I mean, we've gotten onto this within the context of Arcane and Peaky Blinders before as well, back to our whole rule of three.
Well, but I wonder then...
Which is that archetype help you frame... This is, again, what people... I'm going to go off on a bit of a rant here, so I'm using my expounding plank.
Okay, is that what it's being called?
And that is the people that
I like
act
the term
like
waffle iron.
Waffle iron. The people that assume that simply because I've digested something and resonate with it on an archetypal level in various ways, and then apply those things or say, hey, I really need to actually bring those things out because they're true of how I feel or what I represent or whatever it is. And then people go, well, that's all you're doing is you're appropriating that particular thing
but then
from the story.
is there a mythological character that does that? Because I swear there's got to be
that
that
appropriates other people.
Well, just the idea that's like, well, but I feel like, because I think that is why I was interested in Proteus at first, is because that was sort of how he was described in the book, where it's like, it isn't just, I change... Because you could make it seem far more duplicitous, where it's like, oh, I just wear a different mask for different situations, and no one knows who I really am.
Well,
but that isn't how
take Paul to act like that.
And it didn't... That isn't what I thought it was saying, because I thought it was much more of this idea of, it's like, yes, I construct my personality based on the things that I think have value.
Exactly.
Which, again, means that my personality is something that I am shaping as actively as it shapes me. And that's where I go, the myth of Proteus doesn't actually have that element where it's like he shapes himself as much as the world around him shapes him. Maybe it does, or maybe rather you could extrapolate that, but it is not, the text itself does never say that. So it's like if there was that mythological character who it's like, I absorb things and make them a part of me, and thus I am self-made.
It's a bit of a Taoist concept in some regard.
I don't know where you're getting that from.
Well, just the idea that the Tao is both singular and all. I mean, it's like
again, how does that apply to what I just said?
Well, the idea of it's both affected by and also affects what is happening. And
I just think that I have used the word all the time that I like, where I describe certain aspects of psyche development as curation rather than anything else. Yeah. Which basically says...
Well, that's what I'm getting at.
I am not merely a product of my psyche. I am also I have an influence over my psyche, and as such, I'm not just driven by like, this is my personality, and my subconscious determines it without my choice. It's like, right. No, I also choose who I'm going to be. There's the famous quote nowadays of the man must be both the sculptor and the stone. It's like there's a bit of that element.
I believe that it's Protagoras that said man is the measure of everything.
I'm not familiar enough with him, so perhaps.
Anyway, the idea in that some people take that as a very humanistic perspective, which I suppose it could be read that way, but really what he's saying is, and I think it's not unbiblical to say that there is a truth to man being a significant shaper of reality. You know, it's like I wouldn't go as far as to say there's this kind of you speak it into existence kind of a thing, but there's a part of it that it's like if you affect your own reality and can shape it as you adjust to the surroundings that you have. I mean, it's like, this is why I say when you talk about curation, that's you receiving or grabbing something that is external to you and choosing to integrate it.
Yeah.
But that's my point. And some people act like simply because it was originally external to you, you're making it disingenuous.
There's two issues. Is that I think it would be equally as unwise to simply. There are people who, again, out of fear of their own subconscious, will adopt everything that's thrown at them, and there isn't a curation. It's just I don't know myself. Myself only exists for other people.
It would be the equivalent of mental hoarding.
Which is again, this is why I think I might be zeroing in on Proteus, despite the fact that I'm not sure how apt it is. Because again, there's this element of like, I just want to be left alone. like.
Get the frick out.
I'm not. It doesn't like. It's not this element of I take on whatever people project on me because I don't know myself and I just want. I'm doing it all for other people. It's like I could have the knowledge of all past and future and I'm not going to share it. And if you ask for it, I'll get annoyed. I find it funny because I just think that there's somewhat of perhaps there's a wry humor that I'm like I probably would do the same thing. If I had all the knowledge in the world, I would just go and live on a little island. And when people came to me for my advice, I'd be like, "Get out of here!"
Yeah, no, I mean that's lawn. Again back to my expounding point, though. It's just
Where is this? Did you coin this yourself, or is this?
No, it's just it's a phrase I'm borrowing. I've curated it. But the notion that if something was originally outside of yourself or external to who you were originally. Everything. Exactly. But then people go, well, you weren't that way before, so you must be.
Well, it's a bit of an onion. We're all like ogres, and we're all onions. There's no core of an onion. It's all made up of its layers. Even Shrek doesn't go that deep. But that's true.
There you go.
When you actually look at it, if you peel all the layers off an onion,
psychological.
You're not going to get to like a bulb that's like this is the center of the onion. It's like no, the onion is made up by its layers, and you are made up by the things. And if you were to strip out everything that's external to you that you don't think is a part of you, you'll find that you don't exist. Well, this is in fact a Zen practice.
Less than the gestalt of the totality of them together.
This is why. Every sort of Eastern guru will always start by tricking you into trying to get you to reveal who you really are. And they'll say, that's not really you. Who are you really? And they make you strip off all the layers. And eventually you get down to the point you go, well, I have nothing if I'm not these layers. And that's when they are like, haha, now I can't fool you anymore. That's the Alan Wattsism that you, as long as you can be fooled, you deserve to be. And the guru's job is to fool you until you've learned all the tricks. And thus can no longer be fooled. Where is your mind? I can't bring out my mind. There, it is pacified. It's literally the point of the story.
Yeah.
So you are always going to be what you digest from the world, but I think being conscious of that process means you get to say, no, I'm actually not going to take that on.
Well, I mean,
someone might be trying to project this on me, and I'm just going to go, no.
That's the whole concept of the gift of insult. I don't know if you've come across that within Zen teachings, but it basically is like there was a Zen master that all these people traveled to and were getting all this wisdom from, and there was one guy specifically that traveled out simply because he was angry and bitter and resentful towards him, and I don't know what the context for that was, but he came in at one point in the middle of him trying to teach others and started hurling insults at him, basically just telling him that he was, not effective in this way, or he was, whatever. And the Zen master said, well, thank you for that gift. And the man said, well, what is that supposed to mean? I just insulted you. And he said, he said, if someone refuses a gift that somebody gives, then who does the gift stay with? And the man kind of thought about it for a second, then reluctantly said, well, obviously it stays with the one who's trying to give the gift. And he goes, exactly. I'm refusing to accept the gift that you're trying to give me, so your resentment stays with you. And it's like, that sentiment of, I don't have to pick up everything that's in life. I mean, if something's out there that I refuse to pick up or I don't want to curate, I just go, okay, I'll leave that over there with you. Thanks for that, but no. And that's, a lot of people miss that about both academia on a high level as well as, I think sociologically, people, there's such pressure to go, you must pick this up because it's a expectation or it's a given social axiom. And it's like, yeah, but it's not a moral axiom, so therefore no. I'm not picking that up.
Well, again, I think if some people, and this is more of an indictment of their own psyche, but they might think that, again, they think you're just taking it on for the sake of show. It's like, I adopt all these things so that I can fool everybody else because I don't really know who I am, and that's really them projecting that they don't really know who they are.
Right.
Because I would be this way without your influence. I'm not merely adopting this because you're projecting it at me. I would hold on to it even if, again, I may just have to make the decision that it's Proteus and I'll just live on my island.
Well, I think the fallacy,
the idea that I could live,
island.
It's like I could actually, and well,
I'm sorry.
And he doesn't actually. This is where I go. It would be far more obvious if it was like, because he's sort of treated as an oracle in that people go to seek him for advice. But I mean, I think if it was something more obvious, where it's like, you know, what randomly comes to mind actually is of all things, in Avatar, the owl spirit who runs the spiritual library.
Huh.
Where it's like, that's for no one's benefit other than merely the appreciation of the knowledge. Like, if this isn't...
One, it's a functional...
And it's not like, I do this so that other people... No, it's like, no, for its own sake, it's worth doing.
Right.
And in the same way, there is something about the idea of, like, Proteus who sees the future and yet lives alone with the knowledge.
Present, yeah.
It's like he doesn't... Again, I don't grab and attain these things and present them for your sake. I would do this if it was on my own. I actually, again, we're just hopping all around for different illusions today. This is not far, like in an apocalypse scenario, I actually think that whatever the weird institute from the Book of Eli that collects art and history from before the war, that's a thing I would probably actually do.
What?
Like if I had the resources, I'd be like, and some kind of apocalypse, I'd be like, yeah, I'll just be the weird librarian who just like collects old things and keeps them. And
somebody's got
not
to,
even for the sake of like
valuable.
Well, and again, but then even then, not even for the sake of like and it's not to say that you'd hoard the knowledge in the sense that you'd shun people, but. It wouldn't be like an evangelical thing, like, here, come and see the stuff. I'd be like, even if nobody ever came.
Yeah.
I would just find it, because that would be something meaningful to be like, okay, I'm just going to preserve what I can of that which is past. And when you have that, of course, a library of what is past is secretly a library of what's to come.
Well, yeah,
So again, you would know the past and the future, and it would be for your own sake, and... you wouldn't have to share it with anybody because it doesn't need to be shared to be valuable. So
that's already you got librarians all over the world going,
yes, he understands me. Well, I admit we could get into this as a topic. This is another one I wrote down. There's in fact a whole subreddit for what's called data hoarding, which is literally people who basically do this, where it's like we download videos or articles or various things simply for the sake of keeping them for future. In fact, the whole Internet Archive is basically what this is about. Have you heard of the Internet Archive? No. That's literally the website called the Internet Archive, and it's essentially there's effectively a plugin or like a thing you can do where you could save any web page at any given time and create a backup of it in the Internet Archive so that it can be accessed in the future, so that if the website gets deleted or if it's like even things like tweets and messages, that even if they get deleted, if someone archived it, you can go back and reference it. And it's like, I appreciate that, and I suppose... I'm not sure what it is, because I'll admit the thing that got me to start doing this is actually just the fact that we have such crappy internet here that I used to pre-download things that I knew I was going to want to watch so that I could watch them at home when I knew the internet wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
So it's like I would almost like set it to buffer and then keep it, because YouTube has that kind of thing where you can like download videos to watch offline.
Right.
And then I was like, I kind of like this, because then you start to realize that like the little library you build says as much about you as anything else, because the things you choose to download are obviously things that mean something to you.
Right, represent who
so
you
it's
are.
almost, it's another form of examining yourself by going, okay, what is it that I would choose to preserve?
Well, this is, I think, a part of the function of art. I mean, we've talked about the effectiveness of what art represents or what it expresses,
certainly the
but
function of museums and such things.
Right, but
art,
I mean,
I
even
would say,
within,
is more of the individual expression.
Right, but I'm just simply
the
saying,
collection of art
looking
is,
at, maybe I should say it this way, looking at art
yes,
and responding to art.
I do think art the art has obviously separate purposes for the creator and the viewer.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think looking at artistic rendering, both whether it's musical or visual or whatever it is, I've said many times that if there are, like, if you're playing a particular song at a given time and it's not just like, I just want something in the background, more than likely that tells me exactly on an emotional level or on a psychological level where you're at.
Well, I think but that's true of anything. In fact, there was a psychological sort of a series of questions that was essentially like, well, and I don't remember all of them, but the one that stood out to me is like, what would you show someone being like either a playlist or a, your recommendations of books or movies, or it's like, what would you have people watch if you wanted them to get like a quick digest of you as a person? And I think that's a very valid question. It's like, okay, that's essentially why I think I am appealed. This idea appeals to me, because I think it's essentially the same way of doing that, but just on a broader scale. Where it's like you could literally, if everybody did this, you would essentially have an individual sort of snapshot of every person. Let's go. What is it that I have saved? Well, I've saved these particular songs, or I've saved these particular books, or I've saved these particular movies. And the fact that I thought those were worth more than others means that these show you something about me. And I think that that's, again, a way of, if you're someone who is not as self-conscious, because I do recognize that is, I almost feel like there's a meta personality where it's like, because, you talk about the big five and like, I'm more open or more disagreeable or more extroverted or whatnot, but I think that there almost should be its own category of self-reflection, because I think you could make the case that openness probably has correlation with self-reflection, but I'm not sure if there's research that would back that up, because I do almost wonder, it's like, is that its own category, like a meta level above the personality categories is the personality of personality?
Well, and I was actually going to make the case, those that think mistakenly and fallaciously that they have any part of their personality isn't made up of external content is missing the fact that from birth we are taking in information.
Yeah, you can't. Well, this is in fact it's
a bit of the nurture versus nature argument. Is it
Burke who said this, or someone was saying? No, I don't think it was, but it's a very old conservative point, and I mean conservative in the actual philosophical sense, not merely the political sense.
Right.
That says, who has ever seen the individual who has not been shaped by his family, his state, his culture, and his religion?
Right.
Because you can't. Like, these things, if you're not aware of yourself, you'll assume that this is just what it means to be, was to be the way you are.
Well, and it will actually have more authority over you when you don't identify.
Yeah, you won't understand that you won't recognize that you've been shaped that way, and that doesn't make it a bad thing.
Right.
Because you can always... It's the way Alan Watts again describes it, is that it's no different than being born with certain capacities, such as having teeth, or having a certain color skin, or having a certain, anatomical figure or certain quirks of your biology. It's like you inherit those things just as arbitrarily, and yet you can still go about life normally. It just means that you have to do it in ways that suit your biology. And in the same sense, you go about life doing things that suit your psychology. Mm-hmm. But if you are not aware of them, you'll assume that your psychology is just psychology.
Right.
Because you won't realize you've inherited it specifically. Right. This is actually, again, we could reach into a whole nother one of my topics. We're clearing the backlog today, because one of the other ones I had was, I called it the false conception of individualism, which is that some people think that individualism means like total separateness from others, which is impossible. Again,
right?
What it
you don't
really
live in
means,
a vacuum.
You can't say like, oh, I want to make my own decisions and not be influenced. What you're saying, really, because you might be thinking that's what you mean, but you don't, obviously, because you can never have. You will always be defined by the groups you exclude.
Right.
So essentially, what self-determination
or not
really means is the right of free association. To say, I choose, because again, you can't choose to be separate from society because it's literally impossible. Even by doing that, you define yourself by society. Like to define yourself as opposed to society is being defined by society. So what you really are doing is saying, I want to choose the society with which I associate, right, rather than having it imposed on me.
But that requires a degree of...
well, it requires ownership.
Well, ownership is, but also wisdom, I suppose.
Well, it doesn't, strictly speaking, require it. I mean, you could choose to associate unwisely, and that will have its consequences, of course. But
right, but
you
in
still
order
are free
to
to
understand that what you are effectively making a choice against something is still making a statement for something.
For something else.
Yeah, you can't have it.
It's both being defined by its exclusion.
Right, exactly.
And I guess this is where I get into is if, coming back to an archetypal standpoint, it's like if there was some character that best described the notion of the mastery of self in the sense of I create my own personality, and it is not merely one that's handed to me. And I don't just mean personality, I mean outlook, worldview, all of the various things that come along with self. It's like to having such radical ownership of that. And I mean, that's a very Stoic principle, this idea of everything is my choice. But I don't know if there's any Stoic mythology. I mean, I could go around calling myself Epictetus, but that feels just as silly as Sisyphus or something like that. I don't know. I wonder, I know that there's no correlation between Janus and Proteus, but now that as I'm describing it, they do sort of have, the vibes are similar.
How so?
In the sense of...
Because I feel like Janus
there's ephemerality in both of them, but also...
Well, sure.
But not ephemerality in the sort of... It's almost infinite ephemerality, which sounds like, of course, an oxymoron, but it's the idea of constant adaptation.
But I don't know that that's true. It's a dichotomy within Janus.
No. Well,
yeah, it's one or the other.
Yes, but the fact that he is that means he is the dichotomy, thus he is infinite variability. He's literally the god of all opposites. That is the way they describe him. It's like he's the god of beginnings and ends, harvest and seed time and harvest, war and peace, coming and going.
See, and that's an interesting
balance. In fact, he had very rarely his own ceremonies because he was always invoked at the beginning of every ceremony.
Right, because it's both.
And in some ways, I think that there is, in essence, it's a sort of a radical ownership of that transitory nature. Because it is the only nature.
Well, and we've talked about that before, but the whole...
In the same sense that Proteus chooses what shape he will take.
That also needs to be a essay, is the idea of the mid-period of people act like, oh, I want to just get from here to there and I want to be done. And it's like, well, if you live your entire life that way, you'll end up in the grave.
Well, you will. I mean, you're always going to do that, but...
Well, certainly, but I mean, to deny the fact that life is the path... is
very zen of you.
I'm just saying it's to deny the fact that's to deny life itself, essentially. You're going to let it pass you by and then end up going, where did it go? Well, you were looking for it the whole time you were standing right on top of it. It's like... So Giannis is not that far off, I suppose. And what's interesting is it represents a similar thing to me in why I'm drawn to Sisyphus, which is that it's a self-evident truth. You know, Sisyphean task exists within cycles of life.
Exists as a character,
right? And in the same way, you know, that dichotomy of it's the already and not yet principle is also a very true.
Well, and that's why when I say infinite ephemerality, I mean there is an essence of sort of the undefinable, the definite undefined.
Right.
It's like literally his own existence is a contradiction.
Right.
And I think that there is something fascinating about that. It's like the eternal contradiction. Because essentially, if you needed a succinct way of describing life itself, that's probably a decent submission, is the eternal contradiction. I am also rather fond of Alexander Pope's The Long Disease, but that's for different reasons.
That's very Poe of you.
It's actually, I quite like Alexander Pope as a poet, so I mean, I think he was onto something with that one, but I guess I also, if I had to describe a mythological, because again, I think when you view Greek gods as like, oh, he was the god of this, that's very one-dimensional. It's like, oh, Poseidon's the god of the sea. It's like, well, not exclusively. He was an archetype. There was a whole lot more that went into it. So right. I think if there was something that I think like what would be something for which I could stand and wouldn't mind being sort of my own symbol. If I could make of myself a mythological character, and vain as the act of doing that might be, it would be something in the way of like something the more you attempt to define, the less you can. And in some way, it's something almost like no matter how hard you look at it, you'll only ever see yourself. So essentially, I'm an SCP.
I was about to say you're an SCP. That was on the tip of my tongue. I was holding out. Just
now that I
think
about it, there's probably is an SCP that's like that.
I was literally sitting there going, when he's done, I'm going to suggest that. That's hilarious that you and I had the same thought. No, it's true. It feels very SCP because it's like the more that notion of the more you try to define it, the more it slips through your fingers.
Well, but again, that's I think perhaps everything I'm saying does always sort of bring me back to Proteus in a way, because that's literally I think it's in the Odyssey in which they go to Proteus to seek counsel for a specific thing, and of course he being curmudgeonly and not wanting to give his wisdom. They try to capture him, and he just constantly keeps changing shape to get out of their net. And in a sense, I think that there's a similarity in that where he's going something that is, because of all things, you made a joke once saying that I sometimes have the personality where it's like I sometimes get the Patrick thing where it's like, I demand all of you to look at it. It's like if someone's being stupid, I will insist that they look at it. And in a sense, I know that there's truth to that on the joke level, but I also think that it's like, again, stoically speaking, I recognize that you can't obviously make anyone do anything, but there is also the element of like, if you dare come to me, I will only show you yourself. I will be the mirror that you have to look in if you want to interact with me.
Right.
So I suppose, I don't know, is there such a thing as a god of mirrors? I'm going to look that up. I doubt it, because that seems like it would be oddly specific, but...
Reflection. Who would that be?
The god of projection. God of mirrors. Well, I could. I suppose I could just make one up if I really wanted to. I'd have to make a bunch of vases and then hide them somewhere in Greece. Ooh. Oh, I have heard of this character.
Who is
Tezcatlipoca.
Which is...
I'm assuming that's Aztec, but I actually I had heard that and I thought it was a fictional name.
Known as the smoking... What?
Smoking mirror. A reference to obsidian mirrors made of volcanic glass.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the mirror. Aphrodite, that's because of, well, okay, now that I think about it, the only god I can think of that it has anything to do with mirrors would be Narcissus. And that's not a very good...
No, but see, because what that represents is being
self-projection.
Yeah, I mean, is like, I'm looking at myself intentionally. What you're doing is being a mirror for others. That's not the same thing, in my opinion.
Greek god of symmetry. That's... Oh, Harmonia. Well, that makes sense. It's funny.
That's not it either.
Well, no, that's not. I was curious about that because it was one of the recommended follow-up questions. They keep referencing the one guy, but it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the actual, like, mirrors as a concept. It's just that was... I don't know.
The thing I think that I'm drawn to with Giannis is that it's far more focused on... I don't know that for my personality, I am the type that wants to curate all knowledge. I like knowledge.
Well,
I appreciate knowledge, but that's more
but it would
you.
Be...
Like, you are a person
because even that
wants...
which you choose to curate does say something about you.
Sure,
because you couldn't curate it all even if you had the time.
But the point is, that's not what is reflected. That's certainly what... That would be an argument for Giannis, for sure, because obviously it's like, well, I know what I'm supposed to be... I know what I emphasize, which is, again, it's the duality of dichotomy. It's only two. It's either or, not multiplicity. You know what I mean? Whereas
Proteus is obviously an infinite possibility.
To me, yeah, exactly. And that, to me, I go, that's too much for me, at least, to represent. I think it's certainly more reflective of you, and I would say that's a distinction in the same way that we talked about the broad perspective versus the more detailed perspective. Because to me, I'm like, I'd much rather focus on one thing and be good at reflecting it than to be like, I will reflect all. You know? But reflection is a good definition, I think, of what you're getting at, because it's not like you're trying to be those things.
See, of course,
you're reflecting
Narcissus
those
is the only
things.
thing that comes up if you look up.
No, but see, that's not
reflection.
it, because again, that's reflecting that's looking at your own reflection. That's not the same thing as being reflexive to others.
I'm not seeing any other equivalent.
So you'll have to just make up your own reflectivist.
That's stupid. I don't think God of Projection's going to show up either. But even then, that's precisely the problem, is that, if anything, Narcissus should be the god of projection, because that's what he was doing.
Right.
He was projecting himself into a thing, an inanimate object. I'm just curious as to what exactly a prophetic old man. So it doesn't make any claim that
You're
Proteus,
a prophetic old man.
It doesn't make any claim that Proteus was even divine in any sense. It says he was a subject of Poseidon, so perhaps he had... He might have been given knowledge by Poseidon. I'm curious about Poseidon because at least within... No, because it doesn't say he is descended of him. It just says he's a servant of him.
Yeah, but in order to be can humankind be servant of a particular...
I think
like, by definition, though?
I actually am curious about Poseidon in Greek mythology, if only because... Not necessarily that I find him at all I see, I resonate, but generally in most of the myths he seems like one of the more normal ones and one of the more down to earth. He's usually less dumb than Zeus. Now here's the thing, I feel like there are modern interpretations of Hades that I actually do kind of like, but I don't think they're accurate to the classical definition of him.
How so?
Because there is a reinterpretation of The problem is I'm not even going to be able to cite where I first heard this, and I'm not going to be able to defend.
No, I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm saying how do you find that distinction?
Because Hades, in the classical interpretation of the myth, obviously kidnaps Persephone because he's essentially like if in a sense it's almost because he's basically just tormented by loneliness because he's abandoned in the underworld. Because he's the only person.
Which
he's the only
you can't
guy.
Blame the guy.
No,
I mean,
but it also turns him into a very kind of weak character. Like the fact that whereas there are modern interpretations that suggest that he actually Persephone falls in love with him of her own accord, and that it had nothing to do with him with the actual kidnap, which seems much more brutal. I suppose the difficulty there is that the Greek sense of morality was, of course, not our modern sense of morality, so to be like, it's a little bit of like the Sabine women thing. It's like, yeah, we just went and captured them and then they were our wives. And it's like, in a modern context, that's obviously very unsavory. But back then, that wouldn't have been viewed as that bad a thing. And that's like, well...
You and I's track are very in sync right now, because each time I'm about to make a comment on something, you're like, yeah, it's about them Sabine women.
But it's like, so the people who have tried to reinterpret Hades is it's more to make it less... Because there is reason to believe that Hades and Persephone are one of the few god relationships that is healthy.
Well, hell yeah.
In the sense that obviously Zeus can't keep it in his pants, and so Hera's always mad about that, and Aphrodite cheats on Hephaestus all the time, so it's like that's...
He's spit in his pants.
So it's like, they're the only ones who are like, yeah, we're just, doing our own thing. But again, I recognize that that's a modern interpretation, but that element of Hades is sort of the less pathetic version, who's just like the sort of quiet and somber god of the underworld. It's like, I guess perhaps the better way to think of it is if you had to take the place of any of these mythological characters.
Well, in that case, it certainly wouldn't be Sisyphus.
Well, it would be if you read the myth of Sisyphus, because the whole point of the myth of Sisyphus is about basically if it's all that he has, then what does he have to be upset about? Again, the only reason Sisyphus would ever be miserable is if he thought he could do anything but move the stone.
Sure.
And essentially, that, from what I gather, despite having not read it, that is essentially the point of Camus' of the book. What he's trying to say is, he makes it into an absurdist allegory where you're just going, exactly. You spite.
You could either spite life for being what it is, or you can just...
No, you do things in spite of life's meaninglessness,
right? No, that's
just doing them anyways.
Yeah, exactly.
So... I feel like if I were given the task of like, which domain do you want to be in control, I was like, well, Hades seems reasonably calm. There is something to be said for just like, I could just do my own thing and be left alone. Then again, I could also do that if I could be Proteus, but the problem is he doesn't actually have any divine... He's just on an island. So I don't know.
There you go.
Poseidon, I don't know enough about him. I just think that in most of the myths, Poseidon's like the sane one. So it's always interesting when he shows up and it's like, oh, y'all are stupid. Gives Zeus a noogie and then he's... Anyways, well, I don't know, any other therapy? I feel therapized.
There you go. Glad I could...
I'll be the god of therapy.
I'll be the god of...
Freudicus.
Be the sounding board.
There you go. What's the god of that? God of the...
That's reflexive, again. I mean, whether or not it's sound or visual, it's still reflexive. That's what I'm saying. It's reflectivist.
There's got to be some Greek, like, what is the Greek origin of... I don't know, whatever the Greek word for these things would be. So maybe that's... But then again, you have to make your own, and then that feels weird to make up your own myth. And then you'd have to explain it to people who asked, and then it just comes... And it feels a little bit like...
You have to communicate it like it's a myth that was always there.
Yeah,
it's like, do you not know that?
It feels like going to a cosplay convention as your own original character. It's like, there's an air of patheticness about it.
This makes sense in my fanfiction.
Yeah, I don't want to be that person. Well, anyways.
You're a freaking Inuyasha.
Why would you lie?